Hello, and welcome to Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts, McCosk.
This is me, Bronze.
I am. So today, as I said, a Christmas special, and because we're unlikely to run events over the Christmas holidays, or not events, podcasts, we're going to do an extra long episode specifically on various Christian heresies prior to the Reformation, as our sort of broad area, topic of discussion. And so, yeah, I think there's not too many ways you can introduce this kind of topic. I think we can sort of begin immediately just by discussing Gnosticism. We're going to discuss Gnosticism probably in its division between East and West, Jewish and anti-Jewish, and then move into discussions of like late antique heresies, and then finally move into medieval heresies, Cathars, Lollards, Waldensians, spiritual Franciscans, Quietism, and I think near the end we can probably do some comparisons between these various groups and other religions. There's a lot of interesting topics of discussion, and there are some very interesting theological areas of comparison where you can look at different theological heresies and how they relate to other religions. Obviously, the most obvious comparison will be Islam, but you can also do quite interesting discussions about Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, those kinds of things. And so I think firstly, McCosk, you know a lot about all these sort of insane Gnostic sects.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Researching them is kind of a dirty pleasure of mine.
This is how we get down with the Christmas spirit.
Discussing people who should be burned. In any case, Gnosticism is very interesting on many regards. It's difficult to categorize above all of them, I suppose we're talking about. I suppose most of our audience knows that this who's very ideological in general, knows the distinction between something that is ik and an ism, and that's kind of the issue with Gnosticism. There are a lot of sects and full-blown religions that can be easily classified as Gnostic, and many others that cannot really be classified as Gnosticism at all. And like the major scholarship does not come from the best place, really. Major Gnostic scholarship of Gnosticism was started in the early 1800s, and by that point was largely just an attempt at systematizing their insanely complicated theological structures, which just like fucking pantheons of saints, well, saint-esque beings, I suppose. The terminology is also whack. But to avoid to bore you with explaining the exact dynamics of the Dodecad and the Decad of one of the sects, just one of them, and not even applicable to all of them, let's talk about organization here. Most Gnostic sects or religion can be broken down into two big groups, uneven as they are. The biggest group of them is the ascetic one. These are your stereotypical ascets, your monks, to those who, based upon their interpretation of the theology, will go on to how the same underlying principles, i.e. dualism, can both justify extreme hedonism and asceticism later. But let's use this division to provide a framework. So the ascetic sects are all about doing no evil, committing no evil, having absolutely no sin, so that you can move on to the spiritual world and the spiritual world being the pleroma, being oneness with God, being the path towards the one. A lot of the terminology Gnostics use is also either rendered in very Christian terms or is very Christian in of itself, because again, a large number of Gnostic sects were Christian in nature, even though we do have some genuine Gnostic religions. So pure Gnosticism in that context. And then you have as mentioned previously, the Hellenistic sects. These sects, basically, there's some debate if they were actually real or if they were just a Christian/Muslim, at times bad mouthing of these sects. But we do have at least a sufficient number of textual evidence, if lacking in every other context, that they must exist. And the theological reasoning does hold out. I'll go into that a bit sooner. So these sects are, as the name implies, hedonistic or libertine, really. They're all about basically reaching the pleasures of the flesh and body and mind, so that you can later enlighten or in other case, literally destroy your physical body to such a point that only your soul remains, is one of the justifications. With these groupings cleared out, since these are, although again not an even group, as far as we can know, the ascetic ones were the majority of groups, both in number of groups, but also the most popular groups, with the Hellenistic ones being fairly rare and fairly minor throughout.
On your point about the hedonistic groups, so this is one of the big things with the Messalians. So the Messalians were, their most distinctive doctrine is that they held that you could see the God with your like carnal senses. So like you could contemplate God and achieve visions, basically, like that are direct sight of God. Now, one of the interesting thing, and they were also like carnalists, so they believed in like, you know, the senses and the touch and all this and that. One of the interesting points there that I think people don't always emphasize, though it should be emphasized, is the degree to which this has, and all of these groups are heavily contiguous with Judaism and like Levantine Syriac religion. So
Platonism, like Neoplatonism influenced or was influenced. There's an entire debate around that. So let's not.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing I will say about Neoplatonism in this regard is that Neoplatonism, I think, insofar as we can ascribe a relationship between Neoplatonism and Gnosticism, the big issue I think with this is that immediately after, Middle Platonism is more important here, but immediately after the death of Plotinus, most of the Neoplatonists shift to Athens. There's a return, basically, like, and Plotinus himself moves to Rome. So, like, Porphyry is operating out of Rome. Iamblichus is bumming around in Anatolia mainly, but Proclus becomes like head of the school in Athens at 25 and then just sits there for the rest of his life. Pretty much he gets initiated into some sects in Anatolia, but the bigger thing about Middle Platonism is the degree to which it's continuous with Egyptian religious traditions. So this is the important difference between Egyptian and Levantine religion, and I think one of the places that you get the origin of Syro-Egyptian Gnosticism, as it's called, is the fact that the Jews have this very, very big debate over whether God has a body or not. So there's that debate with some people like the Merkabah mystics, the chariot mystics, as you see in Isaiah, holding that God has a body and you can see this body. And they give like the dimensions of the body and so forth. Christianity has like very obvious corollaries to this. I mean, it's like very easy for me to say Christ is God's body. That's like a very easy ascription to make. And seeing as you have accounts from St. Paul where he says that he sees Christ's body, like he physically sees Christ, and there's, you have saints who talk about sticking hands and things. It's like a very obvious way to hold to this kind of carnalist view, which was quite influential. Then the important point about Egyptian religion and Neoplatonism is basically the Egyptians are really into like knowledge of God, so like knowledge of chaos, basically like first principle, aperon. So they're really into like salvific knowledge.
Yeah, that's why like Hermeticism has such strong connotations with Egypt.
Yeah,
don't actually know if we're going to touch on Hermeticism because it wasn't really a heresy of anything; it was its own thing. But,
I mean, it was just straight up religion. I think. I mean, it's like I think Hermeticism. The best reading I think you can give of Hermeticism is basically that it's like a religious movement a parallel religious movement in Egypt, and
Egypt and the lower Levant.
Yeah, and basically the thing I wanted to emphasize there is that these kinds of intellectual trends are very dynamic, and what is very interesting about all of these religious traditions is that, especially in this early period, you see people like Saint Clement of Alexandria, who is an Orthodox Christian, a very Orthodox Christian, who is very, very big on salvific knowledge. All of his texts are also written in an esoteric fashion. And Celsus and Origen, Origen in Contra Celsus, is essentially debating the degree to which like Christianity is like a perennialist religion, which is also like important, and it's this sort of focus on salvific knowledge that comes out of Egypt primarily, and this is not a thing that I think you see in even in Plato. Really, I don't think you see it in prior stuff in the concept of salvific knowledge. You don't really see it, I think, in Platonism.
But you do see it in Gnostic sects.
Yeah, and I think it's an Egyptian thing. That's, I think, more than it is people like, oh, Neoplatonism. I think more fundamentally, it's just the fact that the Egyptian.
But Alexandria was also like a center of Neoplatonic thinking, or just thinking in general. So
yeah, and but the thing is, like, when like Porphyry in his biography of Plotinus specifically mentions, like, Plotinus goes to a place and gets initiated by the Egyptian priests. He goes to a place and he communes with the goddess Isis. It's not a case of like, in Alexandria, even if Alexandria was this kind of focus point, this locus, the Neoplatonists themselves are quite clear that they are continuing a religious, a theological tradition that they see as being rooted in Egypt and Iraq and and in Zoroastrianism. Porphyry is very vehement about this. He says, like, he basically accuses like the Gnostics of lying about the source of their knowledge. Because he thinks that there's some sects who write books like the Book of Zoroaster, and he sort of says, these are forgeries designed to trick the foolish, and stuff like this. And I think this is an important point to make, primarily because I think what is so distinctive about Syro-Egyptian Gnosticism, especially Gospel of John, is this complete Deus abscondicus, absconditus, like God without any body, beyond conceptuality in any form.
Yeah, the one.
The one, the supreme one, and they call him Abraxas, whatever.
Yeah. Okay, just so we don't because
I feel like we need to back up a little bit here.
Yeah, going to go back up. Okay, so listener, the like 5 minute expose I gave can be, although all of it is accurate and all of it is very interesting, a bit hard to digest. So let me like framework this a little bit. Okay, Gnosticism, if we are very generous with the term, means a tremendous amount of sects. Most of what I am says applies to the Christian Gnostics variants, which, well, are a significant amount of those that we know of. I mean, some of them didn't even go beyond just being texts. So we don't even have any account for if they actually were formulated into belief systems. But to give a more encompassing division, okay. Well, not to give a more encompassing division, I already gave the hedonistic versus ascetic definition, which is fairly encompassing. But I am mentioned a geographical one, the Syro-Egyptian one. You have a nexus of thinking, obviously, but also of other religious weirdness in Egypt/Judea, which are traditionally considered, not traditionally, but are sometimes lumped as a single area of like theological thinking, very influenced by Judaism and Egyptian religion, and to a greater or lesser degree Platonism. And the norther you go along the East Mediterranean to Byzantium, your Athens, your Greece, the influence of Platonism and Zoroastrianism and other becomes stronger. So it is not it's difficult. The reason why historiographers don't really do this is that it's very difficult to pinpoint where one or the other started. Add to this already complicated mix those that are directly stemming from Christianity. So you have like your violent anti-Judaizers, Gnostic sects, which there is even
like Marcion.
Yeah, Marcionism. Yeah, where it's even sometimes difficult to figure out if they're Marcion. So I guess we should like give a brief overview of what is stereotypical Gnostic beliefs. So Gnosticism is stereotypically seen as a dualist religion. There are two original principles. Well, most of the time there are two. Sometimes it's more complicated. Sometimes there's just one, rendering the term dualism kind of pointless, but them's the breaks. One good, immaterial, utterly immaterial, utterly alien, almost completely unknowable. Unknowable in the sense that it had to be revealed, more or less so than you get it yourself. Like it had to be revealed through divine gnosis. And you have an evil material god. This seems simple, and seems very Zoroastrian, I guess, and you could argue that all of this has a tinge of bastardized understanding of Zoroastrianism, because Zoroastrianism has a good god and a bad god, sure, but it's still a monotheistic religion in the sense that there is only one creative principle, one single principle. The issue here with these various sects is that outside of this, it becomes very complicated because it intercepts with a lot of things. So you have your it's not Pelagianism, Pelagianism. God damn it!
Pelagianism, I wouldn't consider a Gnosticism.
I'm not saying. Well, unless I'm not mistaken the name, but yeah, I was thinking about those that have the more classical Greek influence, because a lot of those sometimes are not even dualistic, because they just say, oh, the demiurge, which is the name these more classical Greek influenced ones, well, Neoplatonist ones actually, give to the lower god or the evil god. Sometimes the evil god is not actually evil; it's just ignorant. In fact, I think it's in Pelagianism that the creation myth goes something along the lines of the higher god created the lower god in his ignorance of the higher god created the material world.
Are you thinking about Valentinianism?
Valentinianism, that's the one. Jesus.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Pelagianism is denial of original sin.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, it was Valentinianism. God damn it. You can now see why I mistook it in my mind. But yeah, Valentinianism, sometimes held to be like the stereotypical Gnostic sect, is actually one of the ones that fit least the mold by what I'd said. It's not even really dualistic because the second god is not actually malicious; he's just ignorant. In fact, the higher god gave life to the creations out of the lower god out of sympathy. Like, oh wow, this ignorant fool made such a good job. I can't just let him hanging. And basically, if the Gnostics are right, gave us life out of sympathy for the lesser god. So already the stereotypical Gnostic religion is rendered monist.
It quickly gets complicated.
It gets so insanely complicated, and this is me just reducing it to the absolute minimum. I'm not even talking about like the weird amounts of the decad and the dodecad and how Sophia had a lot of this. But yeah, so dualism, good God versus bad God. The stereotype is good God made the soul, the spiritual world, etc., etc. Bad God made the material world, stole and captured, tricked, what have you, the souls from the souls from the spiritual universe into the material world and encased them in the human body. There's a lot more theology than this. I'm like deliberately not mentioning the Sophia mythos part for now because I'm going to like segue this into the ethics and then I'm going to explain the Sophia mythos part because that one has a less perceptible impact on the ethics of these sects, because I'm going to explain why were they hedonistic and why they were aesthetic at the same time. So you have good God and you have bad God, right? How does this imply like daily socialization? Well, there's two very simple logics here. Does your religion conceive of reincarnation or not? Is really the big one that determines whether a sect is hedonistic or a sect is aesthetic. Because these faiths, Gnosticism and dualisms, I suppose in general, do not conceive of hell because reality, material existence, is already hell. So, upon this realization, the sects reached a brilliant conclusion. Some sects, the hedonistic ones, believed that, because of our divine nature, our divine spark, as it were, when we die, we automatically ascend to the upper level, to the spiritual world, or to the level in between, because some of them did conceive of level in between. But basically, boil it down: when we die, we automatically ascend, irregardless of what we do. So many hedonistic sects straight up went massive amounts of sin, because what's the harm? What's it going to do? It ain't going to taint our souls.
Also, it should be noted here, a lot of the time when you're talking about massive amounts of sin within the context of Christian writings, that primarily means the performance of magic. So basically you see this fairly consistently, like Basilides. Basilides' sect is very interested in Basilidianism, which is Alexandrian Gnosticism. Is very, very pro magic, like doing magic, more so than you will see in, like they'll do invocation, that kind of thing, more so than you'll see with Christians or even Neoplatonists, other than Iamblichus.
Yeah. A large amount of it was magical practice. The other amount was very libertine existence, gluttony, and promiscuity and incest.
I mean, the other thing to be noted is that sometimes when people say about, like, when they use the term incest and like they use these kinds of terms, they're essentially like euthemizing, like they're using euphemisms for magic. So or euphemisms for other things. So Marcion is described as a violator of virgins by a lot of Christian anti-heresy writers. That's a euphemism for that he caused people to enter into heresy, because the church is a virgin, and so then he's violating the virgin by causing schism and heresy.
You might, dear listener, you might start to realize why I am, and really everyone here has been so tight-lipped about actually mentioning the writings of the church. Well, not contemporary writings, basically, of these heresies, because it's very difficult to get what they're meaning most of the time. So most of the information we're going off here is like very much more recent scholarship.
Yeah, and a lot of the scholarship, unfortunately, a large portion of the scholarship is sort of essentially highly polemical, like American authors who, it's this kind of revisionist woman mysticism kind of where they woman mysticism stuff that you see quite often, which is just kind of bad scholarship usually, especially because most of these, as a result of the fact that many of these groups are highly ascetic, they were usually more anti-marriage.
Very anti-woman, in fact.
Extremely. I mean, the Thomasine Gnosticism, like the Gospel of Thomas ends, the final aphorism of the Gospel of Gnosticism is Saint Peter asking, will Mary enter heaven? Because she's a woman, so she can't enter heaven. And then Jesus saying, oh, she was so pure, we made her a man.
Yeah. As said, Gnosticism is a wild ride.
Yeah, so like I mean, that's, like this is the kind of literature that you have. And
picture. Yeah. So dear listener, if you remember, just a minor recap, the Gnostic sects that traditionally did not conceive of reincarnation tended to over time become libertine, or were, I suppose using the term of over time implies we actually have the records of how one of them developed. We don't. Because just theologically, it becomes kind of impossible to justify any coherent morality if you're going to heaven no matter what you do. So universalism, basically.
But not like the sophisticated universe, like kindergartner's first concept of universalism.
Even that,
coupled with just the like justification of using magic, because the other thing here is that if you actually look at, like, the most important thing here is the Nag Hammadi library, and the fact of the matter is the Nag Hammadi library was a set of scrolls that had been thrown out of a monastery after the bishop clamped down controls on the monks. So in all likelihood, the primary people practicing Gnosticism were monks and like ascetics. So the degree to which like they would engage in, say, sexual immorality or something, or have the opportunity to engage in that, is lesser than other people. What you find quite often, I mean, this is even a thing, like this is a very well attested thing that people in Roman society in general would do, is if you didn't like someone, you would cast curses on them. This is like the thing that Christianity attempted to destroy. So, stuff like the Library of Alexandria, for example, what was in the Library of Alexandria, or the Cultus of Seraphim or whatever, was primarily magical texts. So you know, the most of the stuff that was burnt by Christians in the Middle Ages, or in late antiquity, was magical texts. So how magic was done in late antiquity, which is quite interesting in itself, because compared to magical systems in India and in China especially, we know insane amounts about how people would do magic in like the 300s, or the 200s, or the 100s, or even earlier in India and China. We know almost nothing, or very, very little, except for like fragments that, like the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri. Fragments, essentially, like almost sentences, maybe some like ingredients, that kind of thing, on how people did magic. And this is in large part because of a kind of concerted effort to crush this kind of practice in these areas, which I think is very good. Obviously, I think it's probably one of the greatest victories for scientific rationality, if you want to be sort of memey, which I always find quite funny, when people talk about Library of Alexandria.
Generally, like that's like a gauge for how middle class you are, how upset you get about the Library of Alexandria.
Yeah, if you're pro burning the Library of Alexandria, then you're like hyper ultra middle class. But no,
it's like a inverse bell curve. It's like, it's like, oh yeah, oh what a tragedy, oh the Library of Alexandria. Then you're really middle class, but like, and then it comes out the other end. I feel like, oh no, it should just, it's all magic, bah. Then it's
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and this is actually one of the important things. When Christians do the sort of meme rhetorical thing of like, let's burn the works of Homer. The primary reason they would cite is because they thought Homer was a magician. Because like it's all like you begin all this stuff by now we have a prayer to all these gods or whatever, and then in the story like Odysseus goes and meets with witches and like has
and oracles and stuff.
Yeah, oracles and stuff, and has sexual relations with them. Sexual relations itself being a euphemism again for this, or for magic. And so it's when a lot of the time when people do these accusations of like them not being ascetics, the big reason will be that they've embraced magic, which if you are, I mean if you're a schizophrenic, essentially, or what we would now label as schizophrenic, and you're an ascetic, it seems like and you're pissed with the monastery next door, seems like a fairly logical thing to do, to start trying to cast magic on them, to kill them, or whatever else.
We really went there, huh?
I mean, I think that is kind of what it is. I mean, like, we have lots of there's lots of evidence that the Platonists would do this against each other. Philosophers would do this against each other. They would like try and kill each other through magic. Sorry, imagine
the mental image of the wise philosopher destroyed and has been replaced by Plato and Aristotle engaging in Yu-Gi-Oh duels.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is like Porphyry, like his big thing of like, Plotinus was so great, we're not worthy before Plotinus, great Neoplatonist, was that he's like, yeah, this guy attempted to do magic against him, tried to enchant him, but Plotinus was just so holy that the magic reflected back onto the enchanter, and then like caused him misfortune. And that's like a fairly common
activated trap card.
Yeah, it's a fairly activated trap card, great soul. Like, it's a fairly common trope that if you are the higher man, if you're perfect, lesser people cannot touch you with magic. So I think this is this is an important point, like in terms of, you know, understanding these kinds of religious groups, the fact that they are really bound up in magic, especially like, because I mean, to kind of pull it back into Gnosticism itself, an important point about Gnosticism, what the word Gnosticism means. Gnosticism is derived from the word gnosis, and gnosis is specifically direct experiential knowledge compared to episteme, which is like rational discursive knowledge. So when you talk about having gnosis of God, that means a kind of direct intuitive knowledge, experiential knowledge, in the same way that I will have gnosis of my car because I just know how it works, or I'll have gnosis of my wife or my children, or my work. Like it's a kind of thing that is just a part of me. Whereas episteme is like, you know, rational discursive. It's the kind of thing that Aristotle was aiming for. Aristotle's aiming for episteme, systematic discursive knowledge of things. So the consequence of this, I think, is both the ascetic groups and the hedonistic groups. Because the other thing here is that when you see, there are some hedonistic groups that are like anti-universalist and just hold the position, I am beyond the law because I am like the foundation of the law. And they get to this position in part because they're like, the Egyptian religion and Jewish religion has this idea of like, basically of some kind of the universe being the result of a unity between a mind, usually some kind of god that is worshipped, and then just like formless chaos. So when you combine that belief with the belief that God is completely and utterly unknowable except through direct experience, so God can't really be discussed, he has to be seen in like a sight beyond sight kind of way, knowledge beyond knowledge, the logic then runs that you are the God who is maintaining the universe. And this, you know, this seems to be a thing in this seems to be the idea behind the Messiah as well.
Yeah, but Simonism, for example, was literally that.
Yeah.
Like he after he died, he was worshipped as a god by his followers, specifically under that logic.
Yeah.
Also, this actually brings us to a very important point when discussing, because as mentioned in the past, a significant portion of most Gnostic sects were Christian Gnostic, and what I am just hit upon was how they often the image of Jesus Christ as a Gnostic savior figure was central to a lot. It's basically kind of the core reason why these Gnostic sects were considered Christian Gnostic. And you can continue. Basically, I just wanted to framework that this is a big point.
Yeah. So yeah, because the thing that really seems to, and I think Gnosticism does speak to that Christ was a real person, because we're fairly certain that Christianity emerged from this kind of what was called the Essenes, which is basically just a catch-all for like Jewish mysticism, and coupled with like the so-called God-fearers, who were people sympathetic to Jewish religious ideas, who were not Jews by Jewish religious law. So Syrians, Lebanese, Jordanians,
Arameans.
Arameans, these kinds of people. Who were generally monotheistic. And the thing there is that basically there was an atmosphere of ecstatic religious ideas, and when the figure of Jesus when Jesus comes along, and you then get the figure of Jesus as this Gnostic savior, the big thing for them is the assumption of Christ into heaven, and then the return, this idea that you purify yourself, so you raise yourself, and then God comes down to you. So you go up and God comes down. And what Christ sort of solves for them is that it gives you a divine figure who is not himself the unknown God. So you have an intermediary, so you can preserve this kind of strict Jewish monotheism, strict Jewish increasing the unknowable God kind of idea, while also having, and this is a thing then also from, we can seem to tell from, that was happening in Egyptian religion. The Egyptians were having this tendency towards monotheism, and the Zoroastrians, obviously. And Christ then, as this kind of divine messenger who appears to you in religious visions, like this is the frame story for the Gospel of John. Christ returns, goes to John, tells him the knowledge, relates to him the message. The reason why this was so important was, in large part, I think, because it solved religious problems, especially for the Egyptians and especially for the Jews. Because if you look at Jewish religion, you get stuff like I can't remember his name. There's this angel, Metatron worship. So at the same time, or sort of slightly prior, the arch heretic of Judaism is a guy who basically says that he goes into heaven and he witnesses, sat upon the throne, Metatron, and Metatron is given the ability to reign over reality by God. So he claims essentially that there's two thrones in heaven. The obvious corollary is that you can become, or you are in some sense, Metatron. Your truest self is Metatron. And you also, or then Christ.
Okay. God, this is going to be one of the episodes. The Christmas special is the most unreachable of them all. Okay.
We haven't even started on the Christological heresies there's still stuff to cover.
This is still the opening move.
I'm expecting at least another hour of content. I can talk for at least another hour.
I can talk for 3 more.
Yeah.
And if it gets too short, we'll start talking about everything. Don't worry. It's this is a bit of a Chungus episode, but yeah. God, I just used the word Chungus. Oh, okay.
Yeah. The rantiness went up to high one. Okay, so to boil down, because this is not immediately apparent to everyone, because this is rapidly descending to let's just discuss obscure and non-self-evident Christian religious theological ideas. What I am saying with your truest self is Metatron, your yada 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 yada, comes from a bit of a esoteric knowledge, as a lot of this is, that follows a certain pattern, right? God exists, and we are patients of God. The patient in this context means waiting on, or we are sufferers of a condition known as God, basically. And there exists this figure, Metatron, or this intermediary figure, because it's not always just Metatron, that basically acts as an interlocutor between God and us. Here's the question. What is Metatron himself? Another patient of God, just as the rest of us. So it is not that big of a jump of a leap, not that big of a leap, especially in esoteric circles. Fucking in esoteric circles, this isn't even a leap. This is like, oh, this is what it is kind of levels. Is that, oh wait, Metatron can be understood to be a metaphor for the human condition. From this logic, then it naturally follows, oh, the stewards of Earth, oh, yada, 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 yada. Hence why this is kind of heretical. The issue is why this kind of logic is heretical is because if this is true, why do you need a priestly case? Why do you need a church if basically all of us are Metatron and can have unmediated...
or Christ, as the Gnostics come to take over. And the thing, especially with Christ as a figure, why Christ is very important for the Gnostics compared to Metatron, is that Metatron, these kinds of figures are they're angels. So, or in the case of Egyptian religion, some kind of divinity. So when you invoke, it's kind of less obviously apparent that they would be a mediator and that they wouldn't be some kind of other divinity that themselves need to be accessed in some special way, whereas and then requiring further intermediaries. Whereas Christ, because of the fact that he was a human of some kind, be that highly spiritual or whatever else, is a more immediate, like, you know, you can talk to another human kind of thing. It's less apparent you can do that with Metatron. And that is why Christ comes to replace, within these religious groups, why he comes to replace figures like Metatron, why he replaces Seth. Seth is another figure here.
Oh yeah, Sethianisms.
Yeah.
Adam. Adam as well. This and some of them, the creation myth doesn't even mention Adam. This brings up to an earlier point I raised up, which is the Sophia mythos. The Sophia mythos is an element, a similar mythology, I suppose, that shares amongst some of the Gnostic sects. Typically, those more far away from Egypt and more directly influenced by classical Greek religion and Platonism. This is the Sophia mythos is a spin, as it say, on the creation of the material world. Because in some Gnosticisms, it isn't even really the evil god that creates the world. It's basically Sophia via her own bullshit, for lack of a better term. So to give you a very watered down and overly condensed version of the mythos, it's basically like this: higher god creates a lot of stuff. Evil god either doesn't exist or it already exists and creates an evil thing, or another thing entirely. But higher god but evil god either doesn't exist or is already present and is already doing evil shit. And then you have the aeons, these saints or angels, depending upon exactly understanding. And in Valentinism, they're straight up the gods of Greek mythology. These are basically the deities, I suppose, in some variation. Or forms that you can like understand of the divine. So they're kind of the easily digestible divinities, but they are not the true high god. In some, these are just self-perpetuating principles of physical reality. It's complicated. They're typically paired. Those, again, couching this on terms of classical Greek myth is kind of complicated. But sometimes these are broken up when they're less connected to the Greek ones into like 12 or 21 pairs of sexually complementary couples, so male and female, each of them with names such as whole and man in Greek, love and reproduction. They have a number of terms. Sometimes when they're 21 pairs, they're breaking into the decad and the dodecad. In any case, The lowest of these pairings, the one that is closest to the material world, is that of Sophia. Sophia, in this case, meaning love.
Wisdom.
Yeah,
Wisdom.
wisdom. Yeah, wisdom. God damn it, philosophia. Yeah, philo is love, not. Yeah, Sophia. Um, she either has a pairing or doesn't have the relevance of her particular pair is often tertiary to secondary. But basically, in some versions, she essentially becomes the evil god, well, or at least provides the substance for the evil god to create material existence. But out of something, maybe an imbued desire to imitate the higher god, or just willingness to create shit, decides to create material existence. She does this by herself without the aid of her pair. This typically results in an abortion. So, in some sects of Gnosticism, the material world is the result, or is just straight up an abortion from Sophia. Then,
or it's created by the abortion, which is the demiurge.
sometimes, as I said, sometimes the demiurge straight up just appears out of nowhere after the abortion has been made. Other times he is the sun that then shapes the abortion. It's complicated. And and the listeners, you might have guessed, after Sophia does something with the world, the already very thin, very almost frayed and nearly broken line of similarity that these sects have falls completely to the ground. It becomes then a bit more chaotic. Some of them, oh, Sophia fell completely. Oh no, Sophia fell. Sophia fell. Only her lower self, Sophia Akamod, fell, and the higher self is still there, guiding us. And just infinitely more complicated. In some sects, Sophia redeems herself via her namesake, divine knowledge of God, and eventually, by being the Gnostic savior, etc., does this and leads us back. In other sects, specifically those that, if you believe in a more chronological example of this, later and closer to Christ, it's Christ that does this. Basically,
Sometimes Christ is the pair to Sophia as well,
or at least the pair to the lower Sophia with the higher Sophia having another pair. It's, as we said, listener, it gets complicated.
It gets vague.
The cosmology is very complicated, and we are like trying to hammer down like 5 different sects that probably killed each other in real life into a single continuous narrative. It is difficult, but the Sophia mythos is like Christ before Christ for the Gnostics. Then you have a mixture in which is Christ plus either higher or lower Sophia that comes and basically redeems her and all of creation, material creation that is, towards the spiritual world. And then you have just straight up Christ. Just copy and paste that shit, said the Gnostics. So you have. So you see this a lot, that the Sophia mythos is sometimes very important, and I suppose the fates that did have the Sophia mythos were the less violently anti-woman of the ascetic sects.
I don't think that necessarily follows. Like, so
straight up like Sophia, like I'll agree that some of them would like result into woman or evil because Sophia, therefore we should hate woman. I'm not.
Well, so the bigger reason I say this is because the immediately obvious reason why you would have like Sophia and Sophia as the creator is that this is essentially a parody of certain pagan religious principles. So in a lot of Egyptian religion, and especially in Greek religion, it is very common that the first principle, the original whatever, chaos, is gendered female. So Gaia, or the best example is Nyx, or the cosmogenic egg, gives birth to a male counterpart who then impregnates her, and from that produces the world. Don't and the
I think there are some versions where
yeah
Jesus is also indirectly a son of Sophia, typically of the
Yeah.
higher one, not the lower one.
yeah. And the point then, especially I think this is like the most classical one is the Gospel of John, the Secret John, and I think Secret John, people are like morons basically, because Yaldabaoth in the Gospel of John, the demiurge, names himself Yahweh. So at the beginning point of when he names himself Yahweh, then it continues with the Genesis account. However, immediately prior to that, he has Sophia as the primary thing that gives birth to the world. That, I think, is a reference to various Greek religion, because what you're essentially going there is that Sophia, wisdom, is stupid. So it's attacking Platonism, essentially. Or if you don't want to say Platonism, it'd be wider Orphism or Pythagoreanism, that kind of thing. So that I think is an important element there.
No, I understand. But yeah, listener, as you can understand, shit gets weirder. But yeah, the Sophia mythos, besides being such an easily like separable, well, easy-ish part to delineate of many agnostic of the more Christian agnostic sects, is a very standout thing, because especially because although in this we have over the course of this VC, made it seem so that there was a kind of chronological evolution from Sophia mythos to Sophia mythos and Jesus to just Jesus. We actually have no evidence that this was even the case at any point. We merely group that in such a way for our own sake, so we don't get trapped, so we don't get lost. We have precious little information on the chronology of any of these theological developments, as it were. Except,
yeah, I mean, I think also there with the point there, I think, to be made, at least with Gnostics, and like there is a degree to which, I mean, you obviously mentioned pagan religious gods, and there is a degree to which a lot of them are like very syncretistic, and I think this does kind of in part point to the degree to which they probably would not have seen themselves as overly distinct from like Homer, and like so I think the Nag Hammadi library had yeah, I think the Nag Hammadi library had let's see, the Nag Hammadi library had just like parts of Homer in it, like just had Homer. Yeah, so the
yeah, but to remind them with that like, although, and this was something I wanted to like raise some objections to your treatment of it, is that there's also reason to believe that the Nag Hammadi library contained a lot of other books that many believe used to be okay. Oh God. Around the 3rd century, there was kind of a generalized, from part of the Christian church, prohibition in using non-Christian books to teach Christian theology. This might seem absurd to this now, but back then,
Peter does this, and when he preaches to the Romans, because he draws many parallels between Jesus and the Aeneid.
Yeah, but that was a thing. So a lot of these texts, and I would wager, like especially the Hermetic ones, were like used as learning aids because, and it makes sense, like Alexandria or Egypt in general was fucking wild in terms of amount of religious people there. So having a lot of these parallels to draw from is what it was probably why they were. And then they were closed, and then they were banned. So there is, so this came only as a sign to me to like kind of give some potentially more contextualization that they weren't all just magic though.
So I mean, I
There's a lot of magic.
don't think that I don't think that they were all magic. And I think you like magic. Like, should you use magic is a very big debate. Like the debate in in Platonism was, should you use magic? Is magic a good thing or a bad thing? And this kind of debate seems to just be a generalized thing in the ancient Roman world. Like, should you contact demons? Should you contact should you attempt to bind demons? These kinds of debates. And I don't think that those are like especially unique to Gnosticism. I don't think that we can like really say that Gnosticism was like, you know, I don't think it's a case that you have Greek religion or Egyptian religion or Judaism and Christianity all as separate religions in the way that, say, Islam and Christianity are clearly distinguishable, or Islam and Hinduism are clearly distinguishable. And I think that is an important point to be made, that what I am trying to say is essentially that when you look at these kinds of hedonistic sects, many of them, when there are references to their being antinomian, not believing in any kind of religious law, often the religious law that they are violating is prohibitions on magic, as the primary reason why you would want to violate religious law as well, especially the Jewish religious law, which is incredibly anti-magic, more so than other religions of the time. So that, I think, is a fairly, I think it's an important thing to think about within religious contexts. The degree to which you think using magic is a good thing, the degree to which you think magic can be used, those kinds of debates, because especially Christianity prior to the Renaissance was aggressively like anti-magic, like to the point that, you know, it's a heresy in the 700s. It's a heresy to accuse someone of witchcraft because you are attributing magical powers to someone, and magical powers are just impossible. And I think this is in large part because of the debates out of which Christianity is emerging, in the Jewish context and in the context of Platonism and in the context of just concerns about the use of magic. So yeah, I think that's a interesting thing to think about. What I also wanted to say, what I wanted to sort of finally move on to though, before we leave this topic, is the problem of like the degree to which the religion is dualist. So you see this especially in Valentinian Gnosticism. The Valentinian Gnosticism thinks that this world is fallen and imperfect, but it doesn't think the world is evil. So it thinks that Sophia failed to create the world, but that there's a kind of cosmic salvation process. And that was probably the most influential single sect beyond the kind of pleroma of Syro-Egyptian sects.
Or more overtly just Christianity and nothing else. Well, Gnostic Christian sects.
Yeah. And
Well,
I
the
think
early ones, yeah, because we're talking. Okay, so as a send off, because we're eventually going to talk about the Cathars again when we talk medieval heresies. Just a small addendum to like explain the early stage of well, the stereotypical understanding of like the development of Catharism, so we don't have to go back this later. One of these sects, these Christian Gnostic sects, that the first one being Marcionism, or at least the first most influential one being Marcionism. Another but later sect of that got to preeminence in the 1800s was the Paulicians. Of their theology, not much survives because, well, they were at war with the Byzantines. But we do know for a fact they were abso-fucking-lutely militant in their beliefs. Like holy war is a big thing for them. Kind of a part of the reason why they came to a lot of struggles against the Byzantines through a large number of processes that I'm not going to bother you this. The elements of this of Paulicianism then went to the Bosnian Church, which from Bosnia, through even more unclear channels, then reached the Cathars, and that's how you got like kind of Gnosticism in southern Spain. Completely ignoring that Spain also had its own like massively popular Gnostic sect. I'm forgetting the name. But yeah, no. So this is like the send off. This is like the Cathars come from a very indirect link to all of this that went from like three different hands. Assuming you still believe this somewhat outdated understanding of the origins.
Yeah, I mean, I think I personally think the biggest thing that should be taken away from like I think the dualism thing is a bit overplayed because I think Gnosticism as a category is like incredibly woolly. I am of the opinion that the two primary things are or the primary things are salvific knowledge as direct experience, then direct experience, and then spiritual hierarchies, and like a focus on spiritual hierarchies. So this is where you get the difference between materialists, soulfuls, and spirituals. So, or hylics, psychics, and pneumatics, which is materialist soulfuls and
Purely spiritual.
Yeah. This comes up in Basilidianism, comes up in Valentinianism, it comes up in Johannine Gnosticism. It's like a hardcore anti-universalism it's a kind of like double predestination, basically, where you say there are these three different groups. Materialists will be condemned to hell no matter what. Soulfuls will be taken to some heaven of their own belief, and spirituals will be annihilated at death. And I think people talk about the parallels there with Buddhism and trends in Buddhism, which is somewhat interesting. But I think the primary place that we see this being, I think personally that hierarchy of materialists, psychics, soulfuls, and spirituals is the sort of central concept. And I think it's why at least I don't think Marcion should be counted as a Gnostic, because he is a dualist and he like rejects the Old Testament, and he seems to have somewhat antinomian tendencies in that he's like anti the Jewish law, but he doesn't have this focus on salvific knowledge, and he doesn't have this focus on spiritual hierarchies. And I think the spiritual hierarchies are clearly the more important part over matter being evil, because what all of these groups have a tendency towards uniformly is incredibly elaborate cosmologies, like more elaborate than late Neoplatonism, where you are subdividing the different hierarchies of gods and stuff like this. Like, you know, it's like demons for hair. Like, there's like the Gospel of John discusses like the creation of man.
This being the apocryphal Gospel of John.
The Secret John.
Yeah.
About,
just to make clear.
Yeah. Secret John sort of talks about like, and it talks about like gods for like your fingernails and stuff like this, and it's just like it's an obsessive tendency towards categorization, coupled with this focus on experiential knowledge, and I think this tendency towards categorization is what causes I think it's basically what causes the dualist tendencies in Gnosticism, because I think it's very easy to get from spiritual hierarchies to some kind of dualism. I mean, this is how people misread Plato into being a dualist, because he's positing various kinds of spiritual hierarchies. You take one end and you take the other end, and then you just say, okay, now there's two things. Even though Plato's like, no, there's a gradient between them. So I think that's an important point to be made, that at least with Gnosticism and the things that you can identifiably say are Gnosticism, so Polychianism, Valentinianism, Priscillianism in Spain, even later, the primary tendency is towards like categorization and direct experiential knowledge that is salvific, that is.
Yeah, that also slides addendum. Yeah, the weird, very influential Gnostic sect of Spain was the Priscillianists. The name was the Priscillianists. God, you said the name and I immediately forgot it. What's wrong with me today?
Yeah, I mean they are. They're interesting just because they are, I think, the last. The Valentinians are interesting just because they attempt to synthesize. Valentinius attempts to synthesize Homer basically with Christianity. So that's like quite, that's quite a wild thing to try and do. But the Priscillians are kind of Gnostics after the concretization of Christianity. Because if you look at like a lot of, say, St. Clement of Alexandria's letters, some of the letters that we've discovered from him, it seems that the way that Christians operate was that, you would get a new preacher or something in a town, and then they would you would query what the guy was teaching with some well-known, influential spiritual leader, and then he would say yay or nay to the specific teachings. So this is what St. Clement of Alexandria seems to do. So he talks about secret knowledge that he has received from prior apostles and stuff like this, on which he then makes decisions. And
that moment when I am goes based and Anglican pilled. Because you called Clement of Alexandria Saint Clement.
Well, I think the removal of him from the role of saints is dubious at best. It was done by some, I don't know, can't remember actually who. And then also, he's still venerated as a saint by like most like Eastern Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox.
And the Anglicans.
And the Anglicans, obviously.
Yeah, yeah. Pope Sixtus V.
Yeah, Sixtus V. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, also he's just, I think, very important. I think he should be.
Yeah, he's important. Yeah, no, it's agreed that he's important.
Yeah,
but yeah.
Based guy.
So yeah, Sixtus V. If you're listening, this is an official call-out video.
Call-out video.
Please respond.
Call-out video on Sixtus V. But yeah, so I think Priscillians basically do this kind of like esotericism just applied to the Bible. That's how I see them, at least. You know, and that I think is quite interesting in itself. But I think we have kind of covered the entirety of Gnosticism, like late antique Gnosticism. Do you have any comments to say, McCosk?
No.
So I think then moving on, we can discuss Donatism and Pelagianism. Huh?
These are typically considered Christological heresies because they
Donatism. No, they aren't.
No, they aren't.
I mean,
Biological ones.
Is this another McCosk accidental Nestorianism moment?
I mean, unless you're saying, yeah,
this
people.
The McCosk accidental Nestorian moment is something completely different.
No, so I mean, the Donatists. It's a very brief thing to say. It's just basically that they were rigorists. So they were like, mainly in North Africa. You could. So basically, they refused to take sacraments from priests who had handed over Bibles or like handed over religious scripture and defrocked themselves essentially under threat of persecution from the Romans. So they were kind of like, you should prefer to die kind of thing. They were combated by St. Augustine as a thing. I don't know much in terms of the connections with anything in prior religion in the area. You could probably bring some connection to the way to like Roman religion itself, because the Romans were very big on like the ritual purity of priests, more so than the Greeks actually. Yeah, like the Greeks don't have anything like the Vestal Virgins, to give an example of that. They have like, you aren't meant to marry, but like the oracles at Delphi could leave and get married and stuff, where the Vestal Virgins couldn't. And then the Pelagius, and Pelagius is one doctrine for which he is known as the denial of inherited guilt. So he doesn't think that there's such a thing as original sin, like in kind of any form. And what is interesting about this is that most likely it was a kind of it was coupled with a kind of hyper asceticism. So Pelagius kind of ends up with a kind of theistic Buddhism, because Buddhism denies that like there is original sin or anything like that. They think the world, there's suffering and so forth, and you aren't united with the unconditioned nothingness. But Christianity, with like the positing of the primary use of the doctrine of original sin, at least within the polemical tradition, has been the justification of married life, as against people who are like, no, you should be unmarried forever. And Pelagius seems to have denied original sin for the reason of emphasizing asceticism. So he wanted to maintain this kind of very common Roman practice where people would just like sell off all their property, give the proceeds to the church, and then live as hermits in like the Gallic forests. That was a very common thing. There's not too much to say else on them. I think we can talk about the Christological heresies.
Yeah, they're pretty big and pretty important to understand. And I think Mikos might have been mixing up the Donatists and the Docetists.
Probably.
Because the Docetists are sort of the first. I mean, I don't know. Several can contest that title, but they're a good place to start. And so the Docetists being sort of the first major Christological heresy state that got that. Did you know? Because it comes from the Greek doketai, which sort of means like apparition. So like Christ wasn't really human; he just looked like he was human. He was essentially like purely spirit, just like a ghost. And if you, dear listener, read the Epistle of St. John, what you will notice is that John loves to use the phrase Christ in the flesh, as do a lot of writers of that period. That, you know, they're like, oh, you got to believe in Christ in the flesh, and then essentially it's very, you almost never find the word Christ on its own. It's almost always followed by in the flesh. And that's as essentially like a rebuke to the Docetists, because it's like emphasizing the role that Christ was, you know, also human. And, you know, the problem with the Docetists is that, you know, if Christ is purely a spirit, how can a spirit die on the cross? How can he die for mankind and defeat death? It's sort of like a key problem.
Yeah. And Docetism has like clear connections with Gnosticism, though it seems to be more mainline. In part,
less complicated.
Yeah,
but that's a bar. Yeah.
And yeah, I think Docetism is this kind of belief that Christ doesn't have a body. And I mean, the logic behind that is sort of the same as like God doesn't have a body, ergo Christ doesn't have a body because Christ is God. So it's just like the seeming of a body. Now,
no, and then, you know, to keep building up treads to that part of the episode, the Cathars were also Docetists. Yeah. And then, you know, you have the big one, which is the opposite of Docetism, which is Arianism. You know, which is the forsaking not of Christ's humanity, but of his divinity. You know, and that's, you know, that one is very survivable, because because like Docetism didn't last that long. It was pretty much in the 1st, 2nd century AD, and then it was over. But Arianism had a much longer shelf life, and, you know, so that states that, like, essentially Christ was not God, but he was sort of like used by God. So essentially,
he was the son of God, basically.
Yeah.
It was not the same thing as God. So radical anti-Trinitarianism, basically.
I mean, right? It's not that radical anti-Trinitarianism. I mean, because you, I think the primary idea behind stuff like adoptionism, especially, is this. It's sort of opposite positions with regards to like the divinity of Christ, where the Docetists are essentially saying, well, he's so divine, he's not human at all. Adoptionists are saying, well, he was a very pure human who then at some point becomes the Son of God, becomes the mediator. And I think you see continuations of both of these kinds of ideas in the big Christological heresy, which is Arianism. Arianism, I think, is the primary one, and Arianism has very clear continuation with Judaism, where in sort of in Judaism at the time, you have this concept of the Logos as like a divine mediator principle created by God before the universe, who mediates with the universe but is not God. And Arianism basically just kind of takes that, and then also like the idea, well, one thing can't be two things, or one thing can't be three things, because also you then get like the Numantimachi, who are like think that God is just God the Father and God the Son. They're against the concept of God the Holy Spirit, which is quite strange, at least to our ears. And then I think you also then get various other interesting. I think that's. Do you have too much to say on Arian?
Yeah, so I've got a little bit more to say, and that's because first off, you start off with these heresies that survive, but then in Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople, the idea of the two natures is sort of solidified, but the question of the relationship between the two natures is still very much in question. This is where Chalcedon and Ephesus and these sort of decisions come into it. Right, because if you establish the fact that Christ is both divine and human, then you have Nestorianism that says that he is divine and human, but that these are two separate natures, and so that it makes sense to then talk about God, that Jesus the man being separate from Jesus the God. Right, and then that leads to another point of contention of Nestorianism, because if you have a separate Jesus the man and Jesus the God, right, then clearly the Virgin Mary only gave birth to Jesus the man, and so that's why Nestor thought that that Mary should not be called the Theotokos, the mother of God, but the Christotokos, or the mother of Christ, because she only gave birth to Christ the man. And so that's why, and that's sort of why the role of the Virgin Mary becomes sort of very important in these Christological debates, and why you in most churches throughout the world will see an icon of Mary and the Christ child, because that's an icon. That image sort of communicates the central teachings that that Christ is both divine, human, and also that these are two united natures. That's pretty much what I wanted to say about that.
I have not much to add. You two pretty much covered it as well.
Yeah, I think as a sort of end corollary there, it's a fairly widely held belief that like Arianism and Nestorianism influenced Muslim theology. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that like you have Nestorian governors in Syria quite late into the Umayyads, and that like a lot of early Muslim theologians were from Nestorian families and stuff like this, which is an interesting thing to think about.
I mean, you also had like more Nestorian governors under the early Ilkhanides as well. You also had some during that time as well.
Yeah, I mean, you even have a Nestorian Great Khan, Guyuk Khan.
Yeah.
Son of Ugadai. He was the Khan for very long.
Yeah, I mean, the Nestorians kind of replaced the sociological niche that the Manichaeans held, at least in Asia.
Well, in outside of the the Tamarind Basin at the very minimum.
Tarim. There's no N in there, at least to my knowledge. But yeah, so I think in terms of that kind of stuff, I think we've covered most of that. I think medieval heresies are then another kettle of fish. And I think we can discuss the Cathars first, seeing as we've kind of laid a bit of groundwork there. I think before we get onto their beliefs, one of the interesting things to think about with the Cathars is their sociological background. So the fact that most of their followers were kind of they were Occitan noblewomen, which is quite interesting as a origin point. And there's this kind of implication, at least, that they were religious. That they were kind of religiously. They were interested in religious groups that were more pro-women, which is the kind of distinctive thing with the Cathars, that they were actually in favor of women, compared to most of these Gnostic sects where they seem to be ambivalent towards women. They were also obviously dualists who believed the material world was evil. It's just they don't derive from the fact that the material world is evil, that like women specifically are evil, more that all people, all bodies are evil, which is quite interesting. Bronze, do you have much to say on like the medieval history here?
Yeah, no, I mean it's interesting because there's a lot of theories about like where they came from. It's very interesting, and they sort of picked up stuff from everywhere. From the Bogomils in what is now Bulgaria, and also a lot of Enochian narratives. About the daughters of Eve copulated with demons and gave birth to the giants. And then they were, eventually in, the Pope Innocent III sort of started taking up the action against the Albigensians, as they were called then, because of the city of Albi, where it started. And then eventually led to Count Raymond of Toulouse launching a crusade. No, wait, no, sorry. Now I'm mixing it up. No, there was a crusade in 1209, and which was ended with the defeat of the Cathars, and then the sort of early 13th century Inquisition started and worked on eradicating it, and that is thought to have been completed around 1350. Is it?
To add to this, because the Cathars are one of the heresies to which we have the highest amount of like info for. We also have a very solid picture on their beliefs because their holy books are actually preserved, and we do know them. During the Inquisition managed to find 2 copies, and if you look enough, you can actually find you can find transcriptions and translations of them in modern day English. It's not particularly difficult to find. If memory serves, like their teachings are sadly not that relevant because yes, they were Gnostics. Yes, they believed in ritual suicide of a kind. Like the profound theological implications aren't that big. What's again is interesting, at least on my end, is like the entire treatment of their historiography. As I said, and as we later, and as we built up here, that there is the traditional and somewhat, I suppose some still hold to it, though it's no longer the dominant one, not by a long shot, theory of, oh, the Cathars are but an evolution of Gnosticism that went from the Paulicians all the way to the Cathars. And this comes from the fact that one Cathar gathering that was witnessed by a Catholic mentioned specifically the presence of a Bosnian of a Bosnian bishop. So that's kind of the Bosnian connection, which later is the Paulician connection, as it were.
The Bosnian connection sounds like a mafia film.
It does. But as mentioned, another interesting element of their theology was I mentioned in passing the difference between the spiritualists, the semi-spiritualists, and the materialists. They had something along those lines. The perfects and everyone else, more or less. The perfects, which after taking a ritual of consolamentum, in which they became purified, became perfects, and those that weren't. This can be like transposed to, oh, it's the spiritualist to non-spiritualist, to the materialist divide with no in between. In fact, the strictures of being a perfect were such that they typically were only given on the deathbed as a kind of last rites thing. Though some people did take them earlier, like and when they were still healthy and what have you. So that's Another interesting thing to which there's some debate in scholarship is the role of woman there in the religion, because there have been a lot of accounts. Well, first we must understand that if we understand Catharism as a separate religion, or as a very violent heresy, give or take, of Christianity, then it is fairer to treat it in these highly gnostic terms. If you interpret it as a strictly Christian heresy and downplay its elements, it comes off across as a very localist, very Occitan, and very violently anti-hierarchy and anti-priestly caste. And in the early days of Catharism, in which a woman seemed to have the most prominent role, as opposed to the later dates, sometimes called the Albigensians. There's sometimes the terminology Cathar for earlier, Albigensians for later period, in which woman seems to have a lesser role, and the Gnostic element seems to come to the foremost. Which is not so readily available, which is not so readily apparent in the early ones, is often a reason to discuss, because there have been fairly compelling treatises that the Christian Church, by its zealousness of persecution, kind of created the Gnostic element of the Cathars, while the Cathars themselves had no true Gnostic element. But again, this is highly speculative scholarship, and by God, are we not experts on this matter? But still, an element to consider.
On another note about the names, the Cathars are what they called themselves, because Cathar means good Christian, and Albigensian is what the wider world called them, because it started, as mentioned, in the city of Albi. Another interesting fact, linking up to Docetism, is that they went even further than the original Docetists by saying that not only Christ, but also the Virgin Mary was just a spirit.
That's quite interesting. Did they give any particular reasons? Like, what was their reasoning there?
I'm sure they had. I don't know. I'm afraid, but I'm sure they had a reason.
I said it's. I mean, heck, I can find them if you want, like the two holy books, and give them give you, I think, the web document in which they are preserved.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that would be interesting.
Cathar Book Club. Sorry,
but
a bit off course.
so do you guys have anything more to add about the Cathars?
I mean, other than they were massacred very violently, I don't have much.
So I think we can move over to the sort of slew of movements that started in the mendicant orders, particularly the Franciscans, relating to the debate around Christ's poverty. And there are many such movements.
For the CK2 players among us, we're talking about the Fraticelli now.
Yeah,
yeah,
the spiritual Franciscans. Yeah, so I mean, this is like, I think, very, very interesting, because so the kind of initial background here is that in the 14th century, there was a man called Jacoim of Fiore, and he creates this very elaborate system of prophecy, primarily, where he says that there's 3 ages of the spirit, or 3 ages of the world, following from Saint Aquinas, or Saint Augustine, sorry, who divided up into 7 ages, with the current age being the 7th. And he basically says that there was a prior age, which was the age of the Father, and that was the age of Judaism, where the Judaic law held. We are currently in the 2nd age, where the Catholicism, like the church, is primary. And then there will come a 3rd age of the Spirit, when everyone is a monastic. So, and that he then predicts that this will be sort of within 100 years, and that doesn't come. But that is the immediate background to which I think we should ground any discussion of these.
Just to add a quick, the reason he thought it would be in roughly about 100 years is because they were Joachim and others like him were interested in the idea of like the first millennium of Christianity, but as it had not happened in the 11th century, they figured that it was the millennium of Christianity after Constantine, after the donation of Constantine. So in the 1300s was when they figured the 3rd age would come.
Yep. And and I mean, he was very influential. He like the famously the Queen of Sicily supplicated before him. She washed his feet. So, you know, I mean, like, this is not a small figure, even though people don't talk about him. He's influential enough that he can have royalty basically waiting on him hand and foot. And he also then exists in that he is a kind of monastic response to the rise of scholasticism. And then also this then dovetails into Saint Francis. Saint Francis of Assisi, very much, there is this sense in this period, in the High Middle Ages, that the Christian church has fallen away from the original spirit of the church, that there is too much usury going on, that there is immorality, and that people are not spiritual enough, and that there needs to be more spirituality internal to the religious orders. This is expressed through people like Saint Francis of Assisi and Saint Joachim of Fiore, where they're kind of anti-scholastic. You also have it somewhat with people like with Meister Eckhart as a kind of less extreme version of this, but still for like monastics. And then you get, after Saint Francis, a lot of his followers, Or even just people contemporary to him. So Saint Bernardino of Siena is a very important figure of this. He's doing like 80-day preachings in Rome, like where the Pope gives him like the papal lectern, essentially, to preach at the crowd for 80 days, kind of thing. And he is the guy who invents the concept of the bonfire of the vanities, where you would burn like makeup, essentially, or false hair and so forth.
The listeners should be aware that through most of this, the Pope doesn't live in Rome.
Yeah,
he lives in Avignon. That's why a lot of people go to Rome, start kicking up all sorts of shit.
Yeah, because the Romans are quite rebellious as well themselves. They at various times try to force the Pope to return, because the Pope has to do the conclave in Rome because of like rules established at some point. So the Romans would often try to essentially kidnap the Pope. They would try to keep the Pope in Rome, which is quite funny as well to think about as a thing that they would do. But yeah, I mean, the big thing is that there's this big awakening of popular spirituality in all throughout continental Europe. I mean, you see this in Italy, you see this in Spain, you see this in just the entire place. And some of this you get Saint Teresa of Avila, who's kind of later, but like you have the startings of serious heavy Marian devotion in Spain at this point, in sort of the High Middle Ages, and you're getting the Grail stories and so forth, and
the foundation of the concept of like chivalry.
Yeah,
well.
Yeah, and all of this is in part because people feel there's not enough Christian spirituality, and people need to be more ascetically poor. And they need to, and this is like the big thing behind St. Francis. So there's this, which the church is kind of like already umming and ahhing about any kind of mass movement as it is. And then add into this, when you start getting people who are like, well, the church is a major landholder and like it owns serfs basically and stuff like this. That's bad because the church is a spiritual body, not a temporal body, so it shouldn't own property. And then you start getting people like the Waldensians and the radical Franciscans, where the radical or spiritual Franciscans start saying, and these are sometimes called the Fraticelli, poor brothers, the church should not have property, or some variation of bishops should not have property, that kind of thing. Often they were still pro big churches, which is something that people seem to forget, that for these people, the primary thing in many cases was some kind of ending of feudalism, that they at least church involvement in feudalism. And you see this actually with Saint Bernardino of Siena. He defends, he quite strongly defends entrepreneurs and like merchants, because of the fact that they aren't like feudal lords. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And I think what you see with a lot of these movements in general is a focus on ascetic poverty that you don't actually see much with later with the Reformation groups. I'm not sure if you'd agree with that, Bronze, but
yeah, no, I think the Reformation groups are acting on a sort of different trend than this one. So yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, seems.
We'll get to the proto-Reformation movements, I think. after.
I mean, a lot of these are proto-Reformation movements.
Waldensians are proto-Reformation.
Yeah, the Waldensians, yeah. You know,
Even
but the-
even like Yakumi Theor is cited by a lot of Protestants as like, you know, because, you know, it's easy to claim you are the people who've brought about the third age of the Spirit, and then also because the important figure here as well is Savonarola. He's one of the most important figures here. Pseudo-heretical. The Dominicans still defend him. They want to make him a saint now, which will be interesting, seeing as he condemned a living pope as like the Antichrist. And he predicts that a Cyrus will arise in the north. He will, and that Cyrus will purify the church. A lot of people, a lot of Protestants in Italy, proto-Protestants in Italy, took that Cyrus to mean Martin Luther. And, you know, this is when you get into like Davidian monarchy stuff. But a lot of these early movements, I think, also are interesting, at least if you look on the more intellectual end, in groups like the Quietists. So the Quietists, I think, by a guy called Miguel de Molinos, what is quite interesting about them is that they emphasized like intellectual stillness as the primary way to achieve unity with God, compared to traditional positions, which is like constant devotion. And people like Meister Eckhart are attacked as quietists, meaning they want to emphasize basically what we would now associate with meditation, to over prayer and like constant prayer. So that's an interesting thing that people discuss quite a lot, and I think it is quite an interesting contrast, because one of the big things that I think you see, at least in Christianity and in Islam, is you don't see these kinds of you don't see trends like Buddhist meditation or meditation where you sort of empty the mind kind of thing. It is in some places. You know, the cloud of unknowing kind of implies that you should do something like this. But like for most Christians, you know, it's like it's meditation on the most holy name of Jesus, or the Jesus prayer, or these kinds of things, where it's more sort of mantra stuff than it is trying to empty the mind. And that, I think, it's an interesting tendency that you also see with this kind of massive upsurge in spirituality in the High Middle Ages, that I think is in large part a kind of response to scholasticism and like high scholasticism in the 11th and 12th centuries.
I mean, you have to also imagine that in the Middle Ages, Quietism was especially radical because silence was viewed as something sort of suspicious and bad, which is why generally, like, you know, it was thought that if you read, you know, books, you know, in your, like, you know, silently, then, you know, that would make you weird and it was dangerous, which is why you would either read books aloud in groups, if, for example, in a church setting, or if you were rich, you would have books read to you aloud.
Often because you're also illiterate as well.
Right? Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean, in some cases, so you know, Emperor Akbar of India. So he was so dyslexic that he was completely illiterate. So he employed people pretty much just to read him and translate translate books for him. So he would get them to read. He would get them to read the Quran to him, or he would get them to read the Upanishads or whatever. And this was like a fairly common thing. I mean,
but even people who could read would have people read to them if they could afford it.
Yeah, because that's fair.
Or they would read it aloud to others.
Yeah, I mean, also, yeah, because like books are quite expensive, so reading aloud was kind of more efficient, especially in like a church setting, because you wouldn't always have multiple books, or multiple copies of the same book. Like a library might just have one copy, and then you have a reading group for that book, and you read it out loud, and you maybe take turns reading if someone's voice gets hoarse, whatever. Which is quite interesting, I think. And yeah, I think in general, the big thing to realize with a lot of these kinds of strange theological movements in Middle Ages, and you see this with like the Cathars. If you compare the Cathars, say, to earlier groups, the like Bogomil means like someone who like remembers God. So it's a fairly generic name.
Friend of God, actually.
Friend of God, sorry. Then Paulicians is a reference to the area from which they come. And
having a more pure version of Pauline Christianity, basically.
Yeah. And then the big sects, like the Valentinians, the Marcionians, explicitly identified themselves as followers of Marcion or of Valentinus or Basilides or
Priscillian.
Or whoever else. Whereas what you see with the Cathars and the Fraticelli and I think the Waldensians, I don't think the Waldensians are named after a person.
They are Walden.
Oh, are they? Okay. But like the Hussites give themselves a name like they give themselves
the Hussites is an exonym, not an endonym. They call them
Caborites, I think.
Caborites, or Calistines, based on the calyx.
Yeah, Calistines as in like chalice, and all of these names are related to like ritual purity, like they are like ritually better. Whereas most of these late antique ones are like, it's the school of Valentinus, or like, people still talk in this way about like philosophers, so they'll talk about Shea Aristotle, or Shea Plato, which means the house of Plato, like the Platonic school. And I think that's it's an indicator, I think, that they took themselves to be like pious, actively pious, most of these groups, rather than kind of like an intellectual school, as it were. If you see the distinction there. I'm not sure, Makosk, how much you would think of that, because I know you have looked at some of this stuff.
It's a way to see it, because like if I suppose it kind of illustrates the context well, in which you have the late classical age experience of religion, in which it's very much up into the air. And I know you don't agree with the distinction at all, but there's still like, oh, is this a philosophy or is it a religion? In which, and when you compare it to like the medieval era ones, you have this is very clearly a religion and not really a philosophy being like the issues. So,
I mean, I do think that there is a distinction, at least in the Middle Ages, between, in late antiquity, between religious and philosophical groups, because at least with respect to like the Gnostics and groups like that, the people like Proclus and the Iamblichus especially basically take themselves to be meta-religious. So like Proclus believes he's like defending all true faith, as is Iamblichus, and they see that, and this is kind of implied with Plotinus as well, that you that they're kind of preserving the true faith, and this seems to be the logic in a lot of Plato's Republic. So it would be more akin to like how theologians in the Middle Ages saw themselves relative to specific saintly cults. That's the direct comparison I would make. Obviously, in certain cases, that distinction somewhat breaks down when you get into like Hermeticism.
Hermeticism is its own thing, as we established right at the start of the episode.
Yeah, that could very well be its own episode, even.
I think we've run through everything. I'm not sure. Do you have, Makos, do you have much else to talk about? We got to the 2-hour mark.
Yeah, we got it. I mean, I would just like to, because we've talked, I would just like to mention a thing that I really should have mentioned with the Cathars, but applies to all of these late medieval heresies, which was very much against this or that specific religious ceremony. Some of them, I don't think any of these were anti-baptismal. No, wait, the Cathars were anti-baptismal. They only had a single religious ceremony, that was the Conciliamentum. But like the Waldensians were against, typically a lot of these things were like related to mass. So yeah, I suppose I should have mentioned this earlier rather than this being the ending bit. But yeah, no, a lot of these heresies, especially like what really distinguishes this from the early heresies, was that, well, to be fair, we don't know much about the early heresies and their religious practices day to day, that is. Yeah, no, a lot of these were also sometimes very strongly, and what I mean very strongly is the defenestration of Prague happened over, one of the defenestrations of Prague after the happened supposedly related to a guy receiving communion in the Christian way rather than the Taborite way, or something along those lines. Don't quote me on that particular example. So yeah, so there was a lot of concerns of ritual, to reinforce a point that was brought up earlier. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave off.
Yeah, to sort of to wrap it up a bit.
Yes, I mean this has been.
Yeah, so essentially, there's the first bit, mindfuck, and magic mostly, but not completely, and then surprisingly simple, and then with the as long as you keep your tongue straight in your mouth, you can make sense of the Christological heresies of the late antiquity, early Middle Ages, and then it gets pretty interesting towards the end.
Yeah, that's a good place to end.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave off. That's a good topic that we've had for the Christmas episode.
Yeah, it's extra long, so you have something to look forward to over Christmas.
Chew on for 2 weeks. Merry Christmas to everyone. We're probably not going to restart until at some point in January. And yeah, this has been Monarchism Unfiltered. I am.
I've been Bronze.
I've been Makosk.
Good night and Merry Christmas.